lunch. I'm sorry we're starting this panel slightly later than advertised in the program, but let us get going. And I would like to introduce to you, first of all, our esteemed panelists. On my left, we have Steve Sawyer, whom you heard speak this morning, the Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council. And then we have Mr. Yanis Tsiporidis, who is the chairman of the Hellenic Wind Energy Association. And then we have Andrei Kevichenko, who is the chairman of the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association. And finally, at the end, Mr. Pachi Landa, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Nordex Acciona. So, without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to you, first of all, Steve, and I think you've got some slides you'd like to show with us. Would you like to move over to the podium? So, ladies and gentlemen, a big welcome and round of applause for Mr. Steve Sawyer.
Thank you very much. I'll try to go through these quickly and get to the discussion points so we can get back on schedule. Where do I point this? Do I need to do something? Point it up there? Technology will either save us or will be our doom. There we go. Where do I point it?
East.
Yes, but where do I point it? Where's the receiver, is my question. What am I aiming for? Is it back here? Is it over here? Is it there? Okay, all right. We'll see how we go. Thanks very much, and for those of you who don't know us, we're Global Wind Energy Council is a global trade association, which all the panelists in one form or another are our members. We focus on opening up new markets in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Just to review quickly the statistics of the global industry, we're now just over 500 gigawatts installed. We'll end up the year somewhere around 520, 17-year average growth rate. We had a bit of a drop in that growth rate in 2016. There are the annual market numbers. We had, as you can see, we were not unaffected by the financial crisis and has had essentially flat 40 gigawatts a year markets through the period of 2009 to 2013. And then growth again in 14, 15, a bit of a drop back in 16 because China only installed 23 gigawatts last year instead of 30 as they did in 2015. We would expect that to creep back up towards 60 for the end of this year, but it's all dependent on the fourth quarter in China and the US. Top 10, as was pointed out several times this morning, China, of course, has about just over a third of the global market, followed by the US with a distant second. Germany, India now is in fourth place, having overtaken Spain, although the Spanish market has perked up again and they may try to challenge India, but that will be an interesting race to watch. In terms of annual markets, Turkey's on the leaderboard now, 7th largest market in the world last year. We hope that that number is repeated again this year, and would hope to see Turkey on the top 10 in terms of cumulative installed capacity before too many more years go by. In terms of the regional distribution, I used to be able to say we had 3 roughly equal large markets across the world, Asia, Europe, and North America, but for the last 5 years, Asia has dominated, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. Latin America has first of the smaller regions to start to show some big numbers, and it would be larger except for since Mexico joined the OECD, they now get counted in North America. And North America, of course, is the most volatile market for reasons which you're all familiar with if you read the newspapers. Offshore has become a big topic in the last couple of years, primarily in the last just over a year since the prices for offshore started cratering, order books started going up, and we would expect these numbers to expand very, very substantially. But Europe will continue to dominate the market for the foreseeable future, although we would expect China as an individual country to start challenging Germany and the UK in the not too distant future, because it appears after 10 years of messing about that the Chinese have finally got their act together on offshore and will install considerably more than 1 gigawatt this year, and probably even reach their target of 5 gigawatts by 2020, and if that happens, then it will take off. These are our projections going forward from where we started, from where we were looking at it in February or March of this year. I still think they're roughly accurate. The blue bars are the size of the annual market. The green bars are cumulative, showing that we would get to somewhere around 800 gigawatts by the end of this 5-year period, which ends at the end of 2001. The red bars are the cumulative annual installed capacity. The green bars are, the green line rather, is the cumulative installed capacity growth, which the numbers are large enough now so they don't change much from year to year. New markets that we're excited about. For the last 5 years, these have been our priorities: Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. Mexico adopted a major program of energy reform a couple of years ago and is now growing to be, well, it'll be over a gigawatt market this year and up from there. Brazil has been the fastest market growing in the world, although with the political and economic upheaval there and in South Africa have meant the last couple of years have been a bit slower, but Brazil is starting to recover now, and I'm told we'll have a breakthrough in South Africa before the end of the month, but I'll believe that when I see it. Elsewhere in Africa, there are lots of markets beginning, Morocco, of course, being the one that's most exciting and growing the most quickly. Ethiopia, they have some political problems at the moment, but is the strongest sub-Saharan market outside of South Africa, and Egypt is the sleeping giant, which we hope will wake up in the not too distant future. In Asia, we were very hopeful about Iran until a few weeks ago. Well, actually, I was very hopeful about Iran up until the election in the United States last November. Now it looks like it's going to be slow going, but there's tremendous potential in Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Mongolia, lots of projects getting up and running there. But the big growth, of course, is in South America, and the latest star to enter the market is Argentina, which, as we've all known for 25 years, has some of the best wind resources in the world. It was estimated 15 years ago that wind resources in Patagonia could supply all of South America's electricity needs 7 times over, and while that's still the case, it's just now getting going with the new government, which just a couple of weeks ago survived the midterms and actually strengthened its position. So we think it will be Peronista-proof for at least the next 2 and hopefully the next 6 years, by which time the market should be very, very well established. Okay, so where do we go from here? Costs. We're now in a situation in almost every market that we operate in, not every market, but it's getting very quickly to be the case that both onshore wind and solar are the cheapest way to add new electricity capacity to the grid, and in some markets now in Europe that has been joined by offshore. And the rapidity with which that has happened is pretty astonishing, because those of you who remember 5 or 10 years ago, this was a dream that would happen sometime after 2020, but we're there well ahead of time. The disruption that is causing in electricity markets, as planners come to grips with the fact that most scenarios and most pundits and most prognosticators now are saying that we're looking forward to an electricity system by 2025, by 2030, by 2050, you can get a wide range of opinions, but it's clear that the electricity system globally will be dominated by cheap wind and solar. The only question is how we do that, how quickly, and by when, and what the percentages finally are. There's a growing movement among companies and cities and even some countries now to go to 100% renewable energy future based on wind and solar. It's happening. It's not happening everywhere, but the electricity supply business is a very tumultuous place at the moment. And it's not only for the power sector, of course, because with the advent of cheap wind and solar, those countries that are interested in meeting climate targets are looking at the electrification of, well, just about everything that can be electrified. We've seen the tremendous not transformation yet, but upheaval within the automotive industry as the electric car begins to take off. You see The Economist just a couple of weeks ago saying that in most OECD markets in 2018, it will be cheaper to own and operate an electric vehicle than it will to operate one with an internal combustion engine. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, this was inconceivable, but now it's reality, and we see electric car sales booming, particularly in places like China, where the market operates in strange ways, and the market parameters are dictated by the central government. But if you want to buy a car in Beijing now, you're going to buy an electric car because you won't be able to get a license plate for anything else. So that's going to transform that sector. Industry, we're seeing now, we have the head of the largest cement company in the world saying they can make cement without CO2 now. They have the technology. They have no incentive to do it. I think we can look for those incentives to do it all with electricity and for doing it with other processes that don't require the calcium carbonate, which creates all the CO2 from cement manufacturing. Same for steel. The real challenges, I think, that we have not yet overcome that we need to are ships and airplanes. And this will all be facilitated by a digital revolution. Some of my more pedantic friends like to make the distinction between digitization and digitalization. Digitization is something that we're all very familiar with, and you turn everything into quantities of ones and zeros to be able to manipulate statistics. But actually the power sector, beyond doing that, hasn't really done much in terms of entering into the digital age, and they're playing catch up very, very, very quickly. It will change everything. It will change the way energy is produced and consumed. It will turn many people into prosumers, in other words, people that are both producing and consuming energy, and will do it through trading and market regulation mechanisms that don't have to go through a central controller, on the one hand, or through a central financial institutions with the advent of peer-to-peer blockchain trading. I'm too old to be talking about this. You need to have a 25-year-old. They can wrap their minds around the words and the implications for what we're looking at going forward. But the possibilities, my daughter's doing a master's thesis on this, so I'm learning from her now. But it's going to completely transform, and utilities, as we know them, will go the way of the dinosaurs. Just to wrap up then, in terms of the state of the market where we are right now, China was down a bit last year. We would expect that to come up again this year, although it's difficult because China, as we all heard the stories, was building a new coal-fired power plant every week a few years ago. Now they're actually shutting down those coal-fired power plants. They're canceling all them, the new ones, and building as much wind and solar as they possibly can. And they have gone into a situation where there is an oversupply of electricity in the country for the power sector. Hence the big push on electric cars and the electrification of just about everything else that they can, but they still don't have a market as we know it. It's still a very essentially planned economy, and especially the power system, and that is presenting some severe difficulties in terms of curtailment and also in terms of keeping their companies in business, which they will overcome by, to borrow their words, probably adopting a market structure with Chinese characteristics, whatever that turns out to be. We will find out. Latin America, thanks to Argentina, is picked up quite substantially. Africa, well, South Africa stalled, and until that breaks, I don't think we're going to see much else in sub-Saharan Africa. Europe, which Giles will speak about, has had a surprisingly strong 2016, and from what it sounds like, a surprisingly strong 2017, but I'll let him speak to that. And India. Again, a difficult and confusing market, but in fact, in terms of their 2016-17, installed more than 5 gigawatts last year. So it's a high demand growth, high potential market. We have 29 markets with more than a gigawatt installed, 9 with more than 10,000. Technology evolution continues. Not a lot to say further except that We are now somewhere around 5% of global electricity supply in the wind sector. Expect it to be somewhere between 6 and 8% by the end of the decade, but we need to get to at least a third before 2050 if we have any chance of meeting the Paris climate targets. So I'll wrap up there, and we can get into more detail on the individual markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. That was a great overview of what is happening globally. I'm now going to try and share with you, ladies and gentlemen, what is happening in Europe. So, the European picture. I hope these slides come up soon. Oh, Yanis, that's your presentation. That's Greece. That comes after me. Yes.
Be my guest.
Well, let me start by telling you roughly what the picture is, ladies and gentlemen. We now have 160 gigawatts of installed capacity of wind in the European Union. 14 gigawatts of that is offshore, and the rest is onshore. This is how wind has grown in Europe over the last 20 years. This is installed capacity you see in the bars. The dark blue is onshore, the light blue is offshore. The green curve you can see is the share of wind in Europe's electricity, and you can see how that has risen now to 10.5%. That's where it was at the end of 2016. In terms of capacity installed, wind is the dark blue line here. It's now number 2 in Europe compared to all the other forms of power generation. Only gas has more installed capacity. Now, with this expansion of wind has come the creation of jobs, the generation of economic growth. There are 300,000 people now work in wind in Europe. We generated in 2015 over 70 billion euros worth of turnover. We are major net exporters to the European economy. Our total exports of equipment is 8 billion euros a year, and you can see we invested 28 billion euros in the sector last year. So that's where we are today. Where are we going? Well, in Wind Europe, we have recently published this document, Wind Energy in Europe, the Outlook to 2020. And this shows you the outlook to 2020. Again, dark blue is onshore, light blue is offshore. You can see those offshore numbers are rising steadily, but even in 2020, wind in Europe remains primarily an onshore play. You can see by the numbers there. 75% of all of the new capacity additions in Europe in 2020 will still be onshore, despite the rapid growth of offshore. You can see that the green curve here is rising more quickly than the capacity installations, and that is because we are installing larger turbines, more efficient turbines, turbines with higher capacity factors. So by 2020, the installed capacity we expect to rise from 160 gigawatts where it is today to just over 200 gigawatts, but the share of wind in the electricity mix will rise from the roughly 11% where it is today to 16% by the year 2020. That's 2020. What about 2030? Well, we've recently published another document, Wind Energy in Europe, Scenarios for 2030. And this shows us that if certain things happen, and I'll say what those things are in a moment, we could get to 323 gigawatts in our central scenario, the red box, by 2030, which would mean that wind was 30% of Europe's electricity. if certain things happen. We need ambitious government policies. We need all the countries in Europe to follow the example of the Turkish government and give us greater clarity about the forward volumes and the auction timetable and the auction design. We need also to keep investing in our transmission and distribution grids. We need more interconnectors between individual countries in the European Union. We need also to make further progress on system integration, on storage, and on demand response. And we need to make a start with the electrification of heating and transport that Steve has just been talking about. If we can do all of those things, then we can get to 323 gigawatts and be 30% of Europe's electricity by 2030. And if we do that, the economic benefits are huge. We would not have 300,000 jobs, we'd have 569,000 jobs in the sector in Europe. You can see the figures for our avoided CO2 emissions, and we'd have in total nearly 240 billion euros of investments over the period up to 2030. Now, a big driver in all of this expansion, of course, is cost reduction. Let's just look at the figures for Europe. Steve has given us the global figures. This starts in 2010, and the dark blue bars take us up to 2016. Fairly steady rate of cost reduction, 29%. But look at those light blue bars for the last year and a half. That is what has happened now that auctions have come in. Auctions, competition. People bid against each other, prices go down. And the lowest bar here, of course, I'm proud to say and pleased to say, is your own TWEC auction, which yielded the equivalent of, in today's money, 30 euros per megawatt hour. Let's look at offshore cost reduction. This has been even more spectacular. Just 3 years ago, offshore cost 156 euros a megawatt hour. Now we are down to the 60s. We've fallen by nearly 2/3 in just 3 years. And you can see these are specific projects in specific countries. Now, you may think offshore isn't very interesting for you here in Turkey, but I want to share something with you, ladies and gentlemen, and it's this: floating offshore wind. You may well have seen that 3 weeks ago, Statoil, the Norwegian oil and gas company, opened the world's first floating offshore wind farm. 5 turbines, each of them 6 megawatts off the coast of Scotland. It's a great project. We think in Wind Europe that by 2020 we will have 10 floating offshore wind farms. We'll have 350 megawatts in total. And look at the costs. By 2030, Statoil, one of the leading developers, have committed to get the costs of floating down to between 40 and 60 euros a megawatt hour by 2030. There are some people in the industry who think we may even get to those numbers by 2025. So floating is going to become affordable. And of course, floating is interesting for you, because most of your coastline is Mediterranean. Maybe in the Black Sea it would be fixed bottom offshore where the sea is shallower, but in the Mediterranean it would have to be floating. And this is going to become affordable for you, ladies and gentlemen. The technology is there, the projects are starting, costs will come down. Right, let me say something now about revenues. We touched on this morning, of course, with the Minister. Auctions. TWEC. Emre Yektan. What's the best model? What's the best design? This is absolutely crucial, getting this right. Some people think, oh well, costs have come down, you don't need any subsidies, you don't need any form of support, go out there in the market and do your projects on a merchant basis and earn whatever you can from the wholesale electricity market. Good luck. That is what some governments think when they talk to us. That is absolutely not the case. As you know, as developers, better than I do, you need that prospect of stable revenues, at least for the first 10 or 15 years of your project, when you are paying back your finance. That's much easier than being completely exposed to wholesale electricity prices. The curved line here is imaginary wholesale electricity prices. That blue stable line is what happens in the UK, where for offshore wind, you bid into an auction and you say, I will generate offshore wind at a fixed price for the first 15 years, and you please pay me that. And so the government ensures that the developer gets that dark blue line. Now what happens in the UK is, if the wholesale price is below the blue line, then the developer gets the difference. But if the wholesale price rises above the blue line, as you can see it does here, on 2 occasions, you, the developer, pay back the difference to the government. This is what we call a two-sided contract for difference. And this is a very good model because it's socially and morally fair. Why should you earn more than what you've bid in for just because the wholesale price happens to have risen above your price? And if this model is designed properly, this could be cost neutral for society as a whole. Let me tell you about one other thing, which is an increasingly important source of revenue for wind farms in Europe. And this is direct contracts between wind farms and large companies, corporate off-takers of electricity. Look at all of these companies. Household names. They have all invested directly in wind farms in the last 5 years in Europe. Some of them have built their own wind farms. BMW have a wind farm next to their big factory in Leipzig. It produces 20% of all of the power that that factory needs. Some of them have signed corporate PPAs with wind farms. So they've done a deal with a wind farm. We will take your electricity for a fixed price for up to 15 years. That might seem quite long in a Turkish context, but these are the deals that are being done. And look how these corporate PPAs are booming, how the volume of the contracts that are being signed is increasing so rapidly. The colors denote the countries in which these deals are being done. These deals are win-win. They're great for us in the industry, they give us stable revenues, but they're great for the companies that are taking the electricity because it locks in their energy costs for up to 15 years, and it makes them less exposed to volatile fossil fuel prices. Now, I mentioned planning and permitting this morning. My members had said, please say something about that if you get to see the minister. It's very important that Turkey has a simpler regime for planning and permitting. This is one example of a key permitting issue that really matters. It's the distance regulations. This shows you how different countries in Europe have completely different rules for how close to a town you can build a wind farm. Some of them think it's not safe to have wind farms any closer than 2 kilometers from a town. Yeah, that's Bavaria on the left-hand side, and then Poland. But most, you can see, have the rule at 500 meters as the safe minimum. This is just one example, but it shows the importance of getting the rules around permitting absolutely right. And there are some more things on permitting that have to be got right as well. Having a one-stop shop, one organization only, which awards all the permits so that you as developers don't have to keep talking to different government agencies. Making sure you've got clear protocols on how wind farms interact with military and civil aviation radar. This is a problem in many countries of Europe. There's some very good practice, there is some not so good practice, and we as Wind Europe are actively bringing together air forces and defense ministries to try and align the rules on this so there's a good, consistent approach and it's easier for developers. Having consistent rules on nature and biodiversity, making sure that all governments are following similar procedures on this so that the NGOs can't suddenly say, no, you can't put a wind farm here because it's in the way of migrating birds or it's going to kill some bats. If there are common rules that are built into the permitting procedure, then people won't be able to complain when the wind farms are actually built. Now, let me say one word about grid stability. The red line you can see at the top here is electricity demand in Germany in the month of January this year. And then the colors are the supply of electricity over the month of January. Wind are the light blue onshore and the dark blue offshore at the top. And you can see there's baseload, nuclear, coal, and gas at the bottom. And what you can see here is that even though we are variable, we are helping to meet electricity demand in Germany. Now, the more variable renewables there are going to be in the system, the greater the challenge this is going to become. But the good news is storage is getting cheaper and more readily available. Demand response is more and more frequent. There are many industrial consumers in Europe now who are turning up their production when there's more wind in the system because prices are lower, and they're turning it down when there is less wind. And they are making money out of demand response. Okay, then we've got to get the interconnectors right. We've got to join up the electricity markets and exploit the fact that the wind is always blowing somewhere. And if we get all of this right, of course, there'll be even more jobs, as I have said, even more benefits to the local economy. This is a factory that Siemens Gamesa have just built in the north of England in a very deprived city of Hull. It has created 1,000 direct jobs and another 3,000 indirect jobs. It's making turbines for offshore wind. I suppose Hull is the equivalent of what is going to be the huge industrial hub for wind that you will have in Izmir or around Izmir here in Turkey. And this, of course, is a good news story. And finally, could I say a few words about the annual Wind Europe event? It's taking place in Amsterdam at the end of this month, 28th, 29th, 30th of November. We'll have about 8,000 people there, close to 300 exhibitors, an excellent conference. Ministers, government officials, banks, the industry, and others. Do come along. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, Yanis, so we've had a look at the world, we've had a look at Europe, and now let's hone in on the Greek market. The floor is yours, Yanis.
I'd like to follow, first of all. Not that active water. How does it work? Yes. Hello. Happy to be here. I'm the Baskani of the Yunanistan Rozgari Energy, but this is my last year. I think I'm giving it up. It's high time for other people to take over, but it's always my pleasure to be here, and I hope I will be invited even without this title. I will try it because this is the global investment session. I will try to give some global perspectives, but Steve has already killed my first slides, so I will go very quickly through those. You've seen those. This is the installations globally, and I will concentrate. This is offshore year by year and the forecast, but I would like to see the market development in our neighborhood, in our mahala. Let's see what's happening here, okay? Which I think is a new view that has not been really given by the other guys. This is the area, Southeast, Mediterranean, and Middle East. No, first of all, sorry, this is the global markets, and you see the 10 first markets in cumulative capacity, and this is the 10 last year. Turkey, for the first time, Turkey is in the first 10 markets. And this is because if we now look at our area in the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, you see these are the installations in the various countries, and this is a very interesting pie. You see what happens in our area. Turkey is really ahead of every other country. Greece is there too, but the other countries have not really developed. There are two conclusions that can be drawn from this slide, two quick ones. First of all, that Turkey is doing great, and you should do your best to maintain this great growth. And I think the message this morning from both of these guys, from Steve and Giles, was stability, clarity, and visibility of future and the investment environment. If the investors know their environment for the few years to come, then they can invest. This is a must to continue the development of this country. You're doing well, and you should be continuing to do well. Greece seemed to be doing well, but I'll have a quick look at what happens in Greece. This is the development in Greece in the past few years. If you go to Wind Europe's site, you will see there that the first wind park of Europe was installed on the island of Kythnos in Greece in '82. Wow, what a great start. But how was it followed? A very miserable development of around 100 and 120 megawatt a year. This is not development in 2017. This is just keeping people in the business, but it doesn't really creating economy or creating surplus to be shared socially. So what's the problem in Greece? We have the resource, we have experience, we have investors. What we don't have is really political will, something that you have in this country. The government decided to invest in wind energy, and you have the results now, and they're really very good. This is the PV installment in Greece, which really followed a drastic installation spree in the years 2012 and 13. We installed 2 giga of photovoltaic in 2 years. Why? Because the feed-in price was around 300 euros per megawatt hour. So everybody jumped in to install. Then haircuts followed, but that was too late. This is the share of technologies in the Greek market. And you see that the solar is still quite big because of that installation. And this is the development of renewable energy sources in Greece in the past years. And of course, we still are based on lignite, and I'm sorry to say that we're perhaps the only European country that's planning to build 2 new lignite plants, which is unacceptable in my view. So let's see what are the perspectives, the green energy perspectives for all of us, for Turkey, for Greece, for everybody. And I will go to Bloomberg. Bloomberg is really taking note of what happens in the world in renewables, especially wind. So the prediction from Bloomberg is that things are going from good to better to best. There is a boom here, and there's a lot of trillions going to be invested in the next few years. Solar and wind are really going to go grow even more. 8 trillion, of which 2/3 will be invested in new capacity in the next 25 years, will be to renewables, which is a lot of money, a lot of projects, a lot of jobs. This is the trillions expected to be invested up to the year 2040 from 2017, and you can see that wind takes a big share and solar as well. This is expectations that are based on current trends, and Bloomberg does not really make false estimates. They really, so far, have been proven correct, and you'll see that at the end. Last year, we installed 138 gigawatt of renewables. For the first time, we said 50% of global installations were in new capacity were renewables. And actually, the cost of the 138 was less than the cost of the 126 of 2017 because costs are dropping down, and the industry is really benefiting from that. And the costs are dropping rapidly for both solar and wind. Solar is already cheaper than coal in a number of countries, and the levelized cost by 2040 will be even down by 66%, and will be cheaper than coal in China, India, Mexico, UK, and Brazil. The same is for wind, which Giles pointed just now. Onshore wind is expected to fall 47% by 2040, but offshore is expected to drop by 71%. That's really big news for wind development onshore and offshore. These are the diagrams depicting this drop from EIA and Bloomberg. And solar installations, as installations, are expected to surpass coal by 2032 and to surpass all fossil fuel installations by 2039. And why is that? What are the other good news that have already been touched upon? First of all, batteries. Batteries are improving greatly. With Tesla and other people really working, we have now utility-scale batteries that are competing with natural gas to provide balanced system for the distributors and cover peak demand. Also, small-scale batteries are really improving. So this is a new revolution because the key to the highest penetration of renewables is storage. The intermittency of wind and solar can only be met by storage. Storage, it comes in many ways. It's not only batteries, it's also grid, it's also electric vehicles, and all that is really improving. Coal is on the way out. coal is out. It's something we have to realize. And on top of its environmental destruction, its cost is really going up. And there is a bubble here. It's estimated that only 18% of planned coal plants will be built. So there will be 369 gigawatt of coal plants that will not be built. Somebody's going to lose a lot of money because they're betting on that. This is a diagram just proving that the coal is stopping to be the cheapest energy form which it used to be. That was the only factor that being chosen for. Gas will remain the transition fuel for some time, but not as much as they used to count on it, except for the Americas where gas is plentiful, and especially for the shale gas. The rest of the globe will reduce its use. And unfortunately, global emissions will peak in 2026. I don't know how many of you remember, but the plan was for them to peak in 2015, 2 years ago. The fact that they peaked in 2026 means that it will be difficult to maintain the rise in temperature below 2 degrees. We'll probably go above 2 degrees unless $5 trillion are invested in renewables on top of the 8 we discussed earlier. This is Bloomberg's estimate that we will go above the 2 degrees, and this is not good news. So we need to double our efforts to achieve that. The same predictions are made from EIA. I won't really go through that. They will be in the presentation because I know my friend Mustafa keeps them there so you can see them all as data for your reference. The prices are going down. The renewables growth is really going big. China is going very well in renewables, followed by India, which is overtaking the EU. There is a lot of development in electrification in areas where there's no electrical service so far, which is very important. Let us not forget that there are 2 billion people that have no access to electricity services, and they will have to have. And solar and wind can really provide electrification in rural areas. The gap we said that. This is the coverage with the integration in the power sector with the demand control. And the most important is the electric vehicles. The electric vehicles are picking up. We have a long way to go yet, but they are there. As somebody has said, if you buy a new car, I think Steve said that, if you buy a new car now, you have to buy an electric vehicle. It will be really a revolution in driving, in transportation. There are problems with charging stations and all the grid that will take up all those charging stations, but I think that the brains are there to solve those problems. The only huge problems that remain are in transport and heating and cooling. I think we're behind in those sectors in covering their demand with renewables. They're the elephants in the room. I think they have to be tackled. Perhaps in COP23 they will be tackled. They have to be tackled, otherwise we cannot reach the target set by the Paris Agreement. And this is just wrapping up all that. And the cost of renewables is really cheaper than fossil fuels, and we haven't really counted in the fossil fuels the cost, the external cost. And if we count in the external cost, then the choice is really far from obvious. And the results are already here. In the USA, the fastest growing profession is a wind technician. And already in the solar sector, the employees are more than all the fossil fuel sectors combined together. And already 10 million people work globally in renewables, which is really good news. But we still have a long way to go. We may have installed new capacity over 50% last year in renewables. Totally, the capacity in renewables is 16%, but production-wise, we're only at 11%. So we have a long way to go. We have to double our efforts. Can we do 100% rest? Yes, we can. First of all, climate change. We shouldn't forget that. Climate change is here, and Donald Trump may say it's a Chinese hoax, but it's not, because 97% of all scientists say it is, and it is because scientific proof of that exists for years now, and that causes the CO2 emissions called the greenhouse effect. This you know all. but I think it's good to repeat it because sometimes we forget why we do all that, okay? It's a good business, but also there's something, and he's pointing at his watch, so I'll go quickly. This is the cabinet of Tuvalu, a nation that's being lost because of rising seas. They convened underneath in order to attract attention to their plight. I don't think people are really taking care. This is the result of climate change. Refugees. Both our countries are facing the problem of refugees from Syria. Studies have proved that climate change has fastened the cause of the refugee problem in Syria. I'll go through the carbon budget just to save time. I'll stay here. Sorry, I can't go back, can I? Let's not forget that when people say that climate change is not true, that there were people who knew about climate change and did not say anything. On the contrary, they funded deniers of climate change. This is very important to keep in mind. And this is a cartoon as an answer to Donald Trump that says that even if it's a hoax, we will create a better world for nothing. So the solution, renewables is the only solution. Yes, we will. This is my grandson. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Yanis. And now, Andrei Konechenko, delighted to give the floor to you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Andrei.
Hello, everybody. My today presentation is devoted to the present investment opportunities in wind power sector of Ukraine. Sorry. In this picture, this is Ukrainian wind farms. The current installed wind capacity reach 579.5 megawatt, including the Crimea territory annexation by Russia, occupied territory of eastern part of Ukraine. Currently about 350 megawatt is under construction and 1,500 megawatt under development. Local manufacture of modern wind turbine of over 2 megawatt capacity has been established in Ukraine. However, there are a number of positive and negative aspects the investors should be aware of. Economic crisis, annexation of the Crimea, and ongoing military operation in Donetsk and Lugansk region negatively impacted the economy of Ukraine, which has been in stagnation for the last 2 years. Renewable energy market seems to recover from the mid of 2016. Love of electricity generation from renewable energy source adopted in summer 2015. Introduced amendments to a number of legislative acts in region to feed-in tariff and local content requirement. Feed-in tariff is valid till 2030. Unlike other CIS countries, rate of feed-in tariff in Ukraine are pegged to euro to mitigate to the risk of inflation. Feed-in tariff rate varies by type of renewable energy and size of installed capacity and covers electricity produced by a power plant minus the electricity consumed by a power plant for its operation. The law also introduced feed-in tariff to private households. Instead of local content requirement, the premium of 5 and 10% to green tariff was introduced for the use of Ukraine and the wind power plants commissioned from 1st July 2015 till 31 December 2024. The regulator will determine the level of local produced equipment based on certificate from the Chamber of Commerce Ukraine and other confirmed documents. Years of 2016 was quite successful for renewable energy sector of Ukraine. About 121 megawatt of renewable capacity were added to the grid. The share of renewable without large hydro in the total volume of electricity sold in the market accounted for 1.4%, most of which was delivered by wind power plants. Wind energy accounted for less than 1% of electricity produced in 2016. But the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association suggests that this number will surge to 10 till 12% by the end of the next decade. Ukrainian energy experts and scientists agree about high wind potential in Ukraine. For example, according to the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, up to 16,000 megawatt could be installed in Ukraine by 2030. 65.3 megawatt have been added in Ukraine in 2017. We expect that in the period of 2018 till 2020, there will be at least 200 megawatt additions per year in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Wind Energy Association forecast up to 1,600 megawatt by the end 2020. According to the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, until 2020, adopted by the government in 2014, the share of energy generated from renewable energy source should amount to at least 11%. Renewable energy source should be reached 26.5 by 2020. Recently approved energy strategy of Ukraine until 2035 provides for renewable energy share increase 25%. As I have already mentioned, Ukrainian presents excellent wind power resource to ensure the development of large wind projects. The south coast of Ukraine, the Carpathian, have the best wind potential in the country. Naturally, the wind development has covered about all areas located in the above-mentioned regions. Currently, Zaporizhia regions with 200 megawatt installed in leading in terms of total installed wind capacity. The first national bank financing renewable energy projects appeared in the country last year. Ukrainian state-owned bank, Ukrgazbank, have become the first Ukrainian eco-bank. Several loan agreements have been signed in the field of wind energy since end of 2016. So, what are the main opportunities and challenges for wind development in Ukraine? Main obstacles to rapid deployment of wind technologies in Ukraine include: power plants can only be built on lands designation for industrial use. Ongoing military operations in the eastern Ukraine and annexation of the Crimea by Russian Federation. In total, about 2,000 megawatt wind projects have been stopped in this territory. International insurance companies are quite reluctant to participate in projects in the country due to high country risk. Local banks remain expensive, exception GSB Ukrgazbank. The factor driving wind power development in Ukraine include good wind resource, large amount of non-agricultural land suitable for wind development, attractive feed-in tariff, green tariff value fixed in euro, possibility of financing from a state-owned bank, no local content requirement, premium system for local produced equipment. Thank you very much for my presentation. It's our members.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Andrei. Okay, Pachi, the floor is yours. I don't think you have any slides. I can comment. Splendid, splendid. Ladies and gentlemen, Pachi Lander from Nordex Acciona.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here today. From a corporate perspective, after having heard the views of the panelists, which I share for the most part, I would like to share with you what is, from the corporate perspective, the helicopter view of the past and the future of wind industry. No? I believe we need to reflect on what has brought us here to a success story. Because indeed what we have seen in the past presentations is a success story. Prices reaching very, very competitive levels and a bright future of electrification and potential growth of demand. No? I believe there were smart decisions made by politicians some years ago that translated into feed-in tariff systems, mainly in Europe, that enabled technology to start developing itself. And remember, wind not so long ago, most of you are long-standing actors in the industry, and you will remember the state of technology only 7, 8, 10, or 12 years ago. No? So feed-in tariff was a very relevant enabler for technology to develop. So that was taxpayers' money, that was a bet. Let's put that into corporate OEMs. Let's see what they can do with it. What we did with it was to develop technology. And then a virtuous cycle started because as turbines became more efficient, bigger, better, cost of energy began to drop significantly. And this, together with, again, some smart decisions of emerging countries blessed with very good wind resource and with the need of coping with electricity demand that was growing big time, given the demographic growth and economic growth back 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I'm referring to Latin America, to South Africa, made regulators take decisions, smart and aggressive decisions, in storing little by little auctions and reversed auctions. So we as an industry needed to adapt to that. On top of this, solar PV started to dramatically bring down their cost of energy, adding to the competitive pressure in the marketplace. No? So we had to adapt to that, and we as an industry used again the resources that were generated to invest in technology, to improve technology, and to come even improving better and better and more the cost of energy to levels that we see today that are totally unthink of 5, 6, 7 years ago only. I mean, this has gone really, really, really rapidly. No? The good thing, if you look at it from, not from our perspective, from the taxpayer's perspective, is that all this value that has been created is reverted back to them, to society, because it's not that we are keeping better margins, unfortunately, nor that the results and the returns for investors are dramatically better. It's not the case. So that is going back to society. No? So I believe if you look at it from a helicopter point of view, is a success story. It's money well spent. Today we have a vibrant industry that is able to dramatically decrease cost of energy year on year and compete with fossil fuels, enabling all those future scenarios of demand growth. Because and there was some discussions about heating, for instance, that we don't see electrification in that field, but why not? With PPAs at 30 and 35 and 40 are reaching levels that there will be significant changes of mindsets that will enable this industry to grow. So the future, 2030, bright. PV will have a very significant development. I firmly believe that wind will have a very significant development as well. But unfortunately, there is 2030, and I come from a corporate environment, and we live and die in quarters. And specifically in discussing Turkey, we gladly participated in TWEC, and it was really a pleasure. Unfortunately, we didn't make it, but we were close to make it. We will certainly gladly participate in future TWECs, as they have been announced by the minister this morning. But I believe that in this transition moment from a business that was supported by politics to a business that will be supported by economics, and that's the better message and the best message that we have. Economics will support our business, therefore we have a bright future ahead of us. There is a responsibility of policymakers still to monitor the transition. And referring specifically to this country, I am somewhat concerned about the outlook of the market in 2019 and 2020, and I believe that policymakers should be given a very deep thought on potential policy actions that they could take to support the industry in this country for 2019 and 2020, namely allowing extensions of projects to happen or relevant similar measures that will sustain the market in 2019 and 2020 until the transition towards a pure economic environment is achieved. So yeah, this has been a fantastic ride. From an industry perspective, we are the enablers of this with our new technology that we provide very gladly, and we are really looking forward to participate very actively in the Turkish market in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Patxi. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard all of the panelists, and we've got 10 minutes, possibly a bit more, for discussion. I'd like to get the ball rolling, and then I'm going to invite you to ask some questions. Do we have microphones somewhere around the room? Does somebody have a microphone? Yes, it looks as though that is on its way. My first question is about Turkey and the wider region. And it is this, panelists. We often hear here in Turkey that Turkey could become a hub for renewable energy. It could become a manufacturing hub for the wider region. Steve, you've talked about Iran and Egypt. Andre, obviously, you've told us about Ukraine. And Patxi, of course, you are a leading turbine manufacturer and have a better perspective than all of us put together on investment decisions in manufacturing capability. How far could Turkey become a manufacturing hub for the wider region, servicing not just the, we hope, rapidly growing Turkish market, but other countries' markets as well? Steve, would you like to go first on that, and then Patxi?
I think with the market size that is as it is now, and if we can grow a little bit, and most importantly have a clear visibility through 2030, then there's a very strong potential for an export market here. The manufacturing market, however, will follow a dictate which is based on two things. One, which is the size and the scale of the market, as well as the local economic environment, but also the demand in the region. And the region is important because proximity is important, especially as we get to larger and larger machines. We're in an era now where shipping is very, very, very cheap. And there's a tremendous oversupply of ships and carriers of all description around the world. That will end sooner or later. And proximity will again become a critical factor in this discussion. So as we look at the development in the region, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for Turkey, but it needs the domestic volume, and it needs the visibility in the market size going forward as preconditions for developing that role.
Thank you, Steve. Patxi. I share your view. I believe that from a market development perspective, we see neighboring markets with good potential that could be served out of Turkey. But then on the pure supply chain perspective, if you analyze the added value of the supply chain, really assembling does not add too much added value, but development of the full supply chain. And to that extent, this country took smart decisions in the past that has enabled already a very decent supply chain already to be here. Therefore, the platform that Turkey today has and the potential is there for Turkey to become a regional manufacturing hub.
Thank you for that. Do I see any questions yet from the floor? No, I will ask another question myself. No questions yet. Please have a thing. Okay. Something none of us have talked about so far is what happens when wind farms get to the end of their normal operational life, let us say 20 years for onshore wind. Now, it might seem premature to be talking about that here in Turkey. Your fleet is relatively young, certainly compared to wind farms in Europe. But I've heard people say it's never too soon to think about a lifetime extension. Upgrade your equipment whilst it's still fairly young and it's affordable to do so, and you'll get good returns on that. Even think about repairing your equipment at an early stage and not wait until you've got to 20 years. Patchy, as an equipment manufacturer, what would your perspective be on this?
We are beaten, our expectations get beaten every year. And when we design turbines with a 20-year life cycle in mind, we have already wind farms operating that are 25 years old and even longer, and they are operating so well. So from that perspective, we need to think, and even if we certify turbines for 20-year life cycle, we are of the opinion, and evidence shows year on year that equipment will last much longer than what we think. So there is always the business case. So whether your wind farm is old enough to think of repowering, how does your connection allow additional capacity? If you have the possibility in your asset to install additional capacity, then I think the business case for thinking in a repowering makes sense. If not, probably your equipment that you have will last even longer than what you think.
Well, we're already facing that problem. As I showed you, Greece had a good start. Therefore, we had a number of wind parks installed late 80s, early 90s. First of all, a lot of them have already worked more than 25 years, and there was first generation wind turbines, which speaks volumes for the technology. There are problems mainly to do with the regulatory authority. These were small wind turbines, 50 kilowatt and 100 kilowatt Vestas wind turbines, or Maicon, Wincon. I don't know names if everybody knows those names nowadays. But if you take off a wind park of 5 50 kilowatt wind turbines, what do you replace it with? With a 250 kilowatt wind turbine? There are not many about. And the regulatory authority does not allow you to increase your permit. Bureaucratic problems, not technological problems. We're facing a lot of wind parks have been already taken down and they're in the process of being repowered. It's happening, and it has to happen. I think there has to be more insight from the regulators to see in the future and see what the future demand will be to allow for better permits for the old wind parks.
Yeah, just to say that it's an issue, primarily one of market and regulatory issues rather than technology. I think especially the machines that were built in the 80s and 90s were so overbuilt in terms of spec. Now, when we get to the machines that were built in the late 2000s and the ones that are being built now, we'll see how much longer past 20 or 25 years they go to, because with the price competition, the margins and the scantlings and the design have become more realistic. But certainly the early Danish and German turbines were incredibly overbuilt and may run for 40 years for all we know.
Okay, yes, there's a question from the gentleman here at the front.
Hi. This is Sardar from TPI Composites. In fact, my question is connected with your question, the manufacturing, being a manufacturing hub, Turkey's desire. I mean, YECA is a good example, but what happens if all the other emerging markets follow this trend? What happens about the industry capacity? How do you see the trend? Thank you.
Patch, I'm going to give that to you first.
I guess you have a very good view because you are a global manufacturer with a global footprint, and in Mexico, China, Brazil, and in very relevant markets. So I'm sure that yourselves internally are facing already the question that you are posing. I believe competition will be driving the final picture, as always is, no? And in the end, you need to be operating in a low-cost structure. What I do see, really, from a supply chain perspective, is that there will be a commoditization of the industry, and therefore, cost of energy and cost is going to be a key KPI and parameter to drive decisions. No? So if everybody's doing the same pattern, there will be winners and losers, and that will be driven by competitiveness.
Yeah, this comes down to the one of the many conundrums that we face in the fundamental conflict I talked about this morning between the desire to deliver the largest number of carbon-free electrons at the lowest possible price on the one hand, and the need to create local jobs and industries on the other. Every situation is different. There's always a local political imperative on both sides. And I just would offer a cautionary tale, and that is the case of Brazil, where they started as the fastest growing market in Latin America, with the fastest growing market in the world for many years, attracted 14 at one stage OEMs to set up manufacturing facilities in the country with a booming market and all the rest of it. And then they have a political crisis and an economic crisis. They also have a strong local content requirement. And guess what? The demand dries up in the domestic market. They say, oh, we can sell it to Argentina or to Uruguay or Peru. Well, cheaper to import machines from Europe or China to Argentina than it is to drive them down over the border from Brazil because of the local content requirement, because they have to buy Brazilian steel, which is a social welfare project. That's not the same case here. I mean, Turkey is in a much more directly competitive market for most commodities and all the rest of it, but it could be a factor in terms of the competitiveness of machines manufactured here if the local content requirement is too high. Not least of which because whoever you're competing with will create the same local content requirements in their own market, which Argentina is doing now, by the way, which will have the same consequences down the road.
Thank you, Steve. There's a question from a lady here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Özdemir from Gamma Energy, and my question is for Mr. Steve Sawyer. You have mentioned about blockchains in your speech, and I'm wondering if you believe the development of blockchains, sustainable development of blockchains personally, and if yes, what will be the short-term effect on electricity market and the power plant design, I can say. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I would have to say is that it is someone your age rather than my age that will figure out how to make this all work, because it makes my head hurt, quite frankly. But I think in the short term, I don't think it's going to have a transformative effect on the electricity market as a whole, but what we're beginning to see are experiments now in Denmark, in Germany, in a few other places, in some markets in the US, where you basically set up a local electricity system, which may be 5 houses. Some of them have PV plants. One might have a creek running through the back with a micro hydro generator. And the entire system works with 5 households with an interface to the electricity market, but where the exchanges are the exchanges of electricity and the exchanges of money are moderated through blockchain technology, where there is no central register of either the electrical or the financial transactions. So there's no utility company involved. It's an algorithm. And wrapping your head around that and the consequences of that for the wider electricity system is what is so transformative about this. But like the internet is a relatively simple version of that, where you don't have a telephone exchange, you don't call into a central building and then your call gets routed to someone else. There's thousands of possible routes for that telephone, for the internet connection to go, and it chooses the best one due to whatever the parameters that are set in the algorithm, which have to do with available bandwidth and speed of transmission and how busy certain lines are. And we will have a similar phenomena, but what the equivalent of the TCP/IP protocol is that is going to govern the trading of electricity and the accounting for it and the financial transactions associated with it hasn't been invented yet, or there are a number of different models. Now, I think what will happen over the course of the next 5 years is these different models will be tested. There will be many tests, and one will work. One will be the Microsoft or the Apple or the MS-DOS, if you will, of the electricity system, and I think it's going to operate at all scales. But for the people that I've talked to who are doing this, the biggest difficulty they have at the moment is getting the granularity of data. In other words, for this to work for your house, it needs to be able to measure your freezer, your fridge, your microwave, your stove, your washing machine, your dryer. Lights with LEDs now become almost irrelevant, but any significant electrical consumption, then of course if your electric car parked in the garage, and data about usage, charging and discharge, et cetera, of all of those pieces of equipment, time of day and all the rest of it are some of the parameters that need to be fed into it. And for a variety of privacy reasons and just we don't really, people haven't spent the money to collect that data and measure it, but that is what I think the digitalization of the electricity system will really mean when they turned on that spotlight and blinded us when we got up here on stage. That would set off a whole chain reaction of transactions of both electricity and financial transactions between different suppliers and consumers in the marketplace around this chunk of Ankara. And there would be no humans involved. It would be done exclusively through computers running blockchain algorithms. And we would learn about the consequences of it later.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. I will take one last question if there is one. Oh, I have two hands up. Yours was the first, sir, at the back. Yes.
I'm Murat Yıldız from Antalya School of Environmental Ethics. Actually, we have another session at the second day. I wanted to refer our session, this general global approaches. So we have a rhetoric in the world, just renewable and green energy. So we have a significant picture that a polar bear is on a sailing ice, we can call it. So it's green energy, and it's just because of its own. But is it generating, on a policy side, is it generating from pollution or ecological issues? So is the ecological issues a procedure for licensing, license issues, or at the last word I'm going to say, is the global renewable energy policy based on ecology included, or just a part of this policy? That was a question, not opposition. Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that. Steve, you may be well placed to comment on this one briefly too, and then Patchy. Yeah.
Fortunately or unfortunately, there is no global environmental policy. We tried from the period of Rio in 1992 and the Framework Convention on Climate Change and then its Kyoto Protocol, but that all came to a crashing finale in Copenhagen in 2009, and what we have now is something very, very different. I think what's interesting to note, the DNVGL, the global consulting, the world's largest energy consultancy now, has just done a new scenario looking exclusively at the economics of the energy industry. And they show an energy transition happening exclusively on the economics. Now, we know here in Turkey and everywhere in the world, the energy policy has an element of politics in it. And the question then becomes, will the politics drive that transition that we're going to see to one that meets the Paris climate goals or not. And I would say it's very much an open question. You have very progressive things happening here in Turkey, in China, in India, sort of. In the EU, got it off to a great start. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks about the post-2020 package. So that we can be encouraged by that and by what's happening in lots of places. But if you look at the federal government in the United States, government policy in Japan, Russia, and Australia, it paints a very, very, very different picture. So I would say very much an open question still. For my grandchildren's sake, for my children's sake, I hope it goes the right way, but it's going to take a lot more than hope. Okay.